They thought it would be easy. Just another evening in a bar reeking of fish and cheap beer in a backwoods Montana town. An ordinary victim, a silent, grim-looking man in a worn canvas jacket, sitting alone in the darkest corner, just wanting to finish his whiskey in peace. Three city boys out in the sticks for a hunting trip decided to have some fun, humiliate the local hermit for laughs. They knocked over his shot glass, poured beer on his boots, threw a stack of bills on the table and demanded he dance for them. One of them, the most arrogant, snatched from his hand a small, polished wooden carving the man had been quietly turning in his fingers. They laughed, mocked him, thinking they'd cornered some helpless drunk, a beaten-down game warden who'd swallow anything. But when he asked one last time for them to return the carving, his voice was quiet and cold as the water in a forest lake beneath ice. And when they refused, something began that no one in that bar would ever forget. Because this quiet man wasn't a warden or a fisherman or a hermit. He was a former major in an elite special operations unit, Delta Force, a man his own government had officially buried 8 years ago. And they'd just woken someone who'd spent all that time trying to forget how to kill. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what city you're listening from. Your support means everything. My name is Mason, or rather, that's what I was called in that life. The one that left nothing but scars and a scorched wasteland in my soul. For the last 6 years, I've been Ethan Walker, 45 years old. My home is a cabin built from weathered, blackened logs on the shore of a nameless lake deep in the Montana wilderness. The nearest town, Timber Ridge, is 40 miles down a dirt road that turns into an impassable swamp 9 months of the year. Here I'm a game warden, caretaker of a private hunting reserve owned by some rich guy from New York who's never once shown up. My job is silence. I make sure there are no poachers. I feed the animals in winter, clear fallen timber from the trails. I live off what the forest and lake provide: fish, game, berries, mushrooms. Every 3 or 4 months, when the salt, ammunition, or generator fuel runs out, I make the trip into Timber Ridge. It's my only contact with the world of people, and I hate every such day. Voices, smells, commotion, all of it like salt on an unhealed wound. My life follows the simple, harsh rhythm of nature. Up before dawn, ice-cold lake water instead of a shower, checking traps and snares, patrolling the territory. During the day, I mend gear, smoke fish, butcher game, or just sit on the porch carving animal figures from wood. This work demands focus, a steady hand, and patience. The same things my former profession required. Only here the price of a mistake is a ruined piece of wood, not lives, not brothers in arms. Evenings I light the stove, read by kerosene lamp from old dog-eared books, and listen to the silence. But the silence is deceptive. Voices from the past always echo in it, especially at night. Every night at exactly 3:17 I wake up. In my ears, the whistle of bullets and shouts in a foreign language. In my nose, the smell of gunpowder and burning plastic. Before my eyes, a snow-covered mountain pass somewhere in Afghanistan, a shattered Humvee, and her eyes. Sarah's eyes full of surprise and pain, an instant before she was gone. 8 years have passed since that day in February 2017. 8 years I've replayed every second of that doomed operation in my head, searching for my mistake, my miscalculation, and finding none. Everything was done right, perfectly, except for one thing. We were betrayed. Someone leaked our route and objective. Of 12 people in Task Force South, only 3 survived. 2 severely wounded were taken captive, and I, concussed and wounded, managed to escape, carrying the commander on my back. Officially, the entire team was killed. We were buried with honors in closed caskets. To the world, I'm dead, and that's good. Dead men don't have nightmares. But I'm not a dead man. Sarah was in that team too, our comms specialist, the best electronic warfare operator I knew. My wife. We married 6 months before that deployment. Quietly, no witnesses, in a little chapel outside Seattle. We didn't wear rings, not allowed. Instead, we had talismans, small carved falcon figures she'd made from a piece of Montana cedar. She said the falcon sees everything from above. He's our guardian. Her falcon stayed there in the mountains, in her hand, soaked in blood. Mine is always with me. I pull it from my pocket. Smooth wood, warm from my fingers. A simple, almost childlike piece. Two wings, a curved, predatory beak. The only thing left of her, of us. I squeeze it in my palm so hard my knuckles turn white. The pain in my hand sobers me, pulls me from the past into the cold reality of the Montana cabin. That November day supplies had run out. Salt, flour, rifle cartridges. I had to make the trip. The road was torn up by autumn rains. My old pickup groaned and slid, but stubbornly crawled forward. I reached Timber Ridge by evening, a dusty, sleepy town made up of old brick buildings and a scattering of houses. I stocked up at the only 24-hour store, tossed the bags in the truck. One thing remained. Stop at the bar called The Catch, drink a shot of whiskey for the fallen, and head back to my lair. The Catch was a grim place. Wooden tables, sticky from spilled beer. Dim light, heavy smell of stale alcohol, smoke and fried fish. The crowd matched. Local workers, logging truck drivers, a couple random tourists. I sat at my usual corner table, back to the wall, facing the exit. Old habit, ordered from the owner, Betty, a shot of whiskey and a piece of rye bread. She nodded silently, knowing my ritual. I took the wooden falcon from my pocket, set it on the table before me, drank the shot in one gulp without a chaser. A burning wave rolled through my body, momentarily dulling the pain inside. I sat, staring at the carving, remembering how her eyes had laughed when she gave it to me. At that moment, the bar door burst open with a crash, letting in a swirl of freezing air and three young men. They weren't dressed local, expensive designer camo, $1,000 boots, heavy watches on their wrists, clean-cut faces, cocky bearing, loud voices with big city accents. They acted like lords of creation visiting a zoo. They swept contemptuous looks over the patrons, cracking loud jokes. Betty behind the bar tensed. Everyone in town knew who they were. Sons of Marcus Harrington, a Chicago billionaire who'd bought up half the timberland around here for elite hunting estates. They came here once a season in their shiny SUVs, shot everything that moved from helicopters, and left behind mountains of trash and a feeling of humiliation among the locals. They grabbed a bottle of expensive scotch from the bar and came to my table. Apparently, my silent figure in the corner seemed the perfect target for entertainment. "Hey, old man, lonely?" said the oldest, a tall blonde with empty eyes. Without asking, he sat across from me, throwing his feet up on the neighboring chair. The other two stood on either side, cutting off my escape. I stayed silent, looking at my falcon. "You deaf? We're talking to you," said the second, a stocky guy with a bull neck. He took my empty shot glass from the table, sniffed it, and grimaced. "Drinking rot-gut whiskey, local trash." The third, the youngest and twitchiest, noticed the carving. "Oh, what's this trinket? Carve it yourself, Gramps?" He reached out and grabbed the falcon from the table. I raised my eyes slowly, very slowly. Inside, something clicked. That switch that shifts consciousness from civilian mode to combat mode. Emotions vanished. Only cold analysis remained. 3 targets. Distance, 3 feet. The oldest sitting, vulnerable. 2 standing, hands down. 7 other people in the bar. Civilians. Exits. Main door. Window behind me. "Put it back," I said. My voice came out hoarse and foreign. I hadn't used it in days. They burst out laughing. "Hear that? He's giving us orders." The blonde turned to me. "And if we don't, what are you going to do, old man? Complain to the bears in the woods?" He took the carving from his friend, tossed it in his palm. "You know what? I'm keeping this. Souvenir from this dump." "Give it back, please," I said. Last attempt. Last chance for them to walk away alive and whole. "Get lost," he said, and shoved the falcon into his jacket pocket. Time compressed to a single point. I saw everything in minute detail. The bead of sweat on his temple, the smug smirk on the second one's face, the nervously twitching fingers of the third. Sarah's voice sounded in my head. "Keep it safe, Mason. My soul is in it." I rose, not abruptly, but smoothly, like a predator emerging from ambush. The 2 on either side jerked to grab me, but they were too late. My left forearm struck the stocky one under the jaw. Short, precise motion. The crack of cervical vertebrae was barely audible over the music from the old jukebox. He dropped to the floor like a sack of bones, making no sound. Simultaneously, my right hand seized the wrist of the third, the one on my right. Yank, twist, and his arm was wrenched from the socket with a dry pop. He howled in pain, but the cry cut off when I drove my forehead into his nose. He fell too, bleeding all over the floor. All of it took no more than a second and a half. The blonde at the table jumped up, his face twisted with horror and incomprehension. He reached into his inner pocket, trying to pull something out, probably a gun. I didn't give him the chance. I stepped forward. My hand went to his throat, fingers finding the carotid artery. I didn't choke him. I just pressed for exactly 5 seconds. His body went limp, eyes rolled back. I caught him so he wouldn't fall with a crash and carefully lowered him to the floor. Then I knelt, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out my falcon. Squeezed it in my fist. Warm, familiar wood. Dead silence filled the bar. The music had stopped. Everyone stared at me with open mouths. I stood, placed a few crumpled bills on the bar for the whiskey. "Sorry for the trouble, Betty," I said to the owner. She just silently crossed herself. I turned and walked to the exit. No one moved. I stepped out into the freezing November night, got in my pickup and drove out of town, back into the forest. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind an icy emptiness. I'd just shattered 6 years of silence, 6 years of trying to bury the warrior inside me. The rust had come off the blade, and I knew there would be a price to pay in blood. The drive back seemed endless. The headlights cut through darkness, revealing only pine trunks and occasional snowflakes beginning to swirl in the air. The pickup's engine roared hoarsely, but I didn't hear it. My ears were ringing from the shattered silence. My hands on the wheel weren't shaking. They were steady and sure, as if they'd just finished familiar work. And that was the most frightening thing of all. I felt neither remorse nor fear, only the cold, calm realization that the game of Hermit was over. The beast I'd kept chained so long, in the darkest cage of my soul, had broken free. I understood clearly that those 3 in the bar weren't just punks. They were Harrington's sons. And men like Harrington don't forgive humiliation. He wouldn't rest until he found me and skinned me alive. The question wasn't whether they'd come for me. The question was when. I drove the truck hard, not bothering with the road, instinctively choosing the right turns in the maze of forest tracks. My mind was already calculating. Timber ridge, the catch bar, witnesses. Even if everyone was too scared to talk, Betty the owner would describe me. My pickup. The plates were old and muddy, but someone might have memorized them. They'd run them through the system, trace them to Ethan Walker, game warden living in the reserve. It would take them a day, maybe 2, no more. I had 48 hours maximum to prepare for company. I could leave, pack a rucksack, vanish into the wilderness, head north toward the Canadian border. I'd done it before, disappearing, becoming a ghost. It was part of my training, but this time something inside rebelled. Enough running. 8 years I'd been running from my past, from myself. Here in this wilderness, I'd almost believed I'd found peace. This was my land, my fortress, and I wouldn't surrender it without a fight. Besides, they'd taken my falcon. They'd touched the only thing that was sacred to me. This was no longer about survival. It had become personal. Reaching the cabin, I didn't turn on any lights. I drove the truck into the shed, masked it with branches, checked the perimeter. The first light snow had already dusted the ground. Perfect. Any track would show up clear as day. I went inside, shutting the door tight. It smelled of wood and smoke from the cooling stove. I didn't relight it. Fire and smoke meant compromise. I pulled the falcon carving from my pocket, ran my finger along it. Memory surfaced of the day Sarah gave it to me. We were sitting on the shore of a forest lake outside Portland, at our cabin, on a brief leave between deployments. She'd just finished carving it. The wood still smelled of fresh shavings. "This is Montana cedar," she said, placing the figure in my palm. "The strongest there is. They say the spirit of a warrior lives in it. Let him protect you when I'm not there." "You're always with me," I answered, squeezing her hand. "I know, but with him you'll feel safer." She smiled. "Keep him safe, Mason. My soul is in him." I clenched my fist. No, I wouldn't leave. I would defend this forest, this cabin, this memory. This was my last stand. I spent the rest of the night working. My cabin wasn't just a home, it was a prepared position. Over 6 years, I turned it and the surrounding forest into my controlled zone. I pulled from the cache under the floorboards my old military duffel. Inside lay the few things I'd kept from that former life. My K-bar tactical knife with survival blade and strike mechanism in the handle. Several signal flares, professional binoculars with night vision, military med kit, ghillie suit, radio working on a secure frequency. And most important, my rifle, a civilian Remington 700 and 308 that I'd lovingly zeroed and perfected. I checked the weapon, oiled it, loaded magazines. Ammunition was sufficient. Then I went outside. The night was cold and clear. The snow had stopped, and above the forest stretched a starlit sky. I began my rounds. Over these years, I'd learned every square meter within 6 miles of the cabin. I knew every trail, every ravine, every bog. I set out my eyes and ears. Simple but effective alarm systems I'd built during long winter evenings. Tripwires made from fishing line tied to bells I'd salvaged from old tackle. Pit traps on game trails covered with brush, shallow but enough to break an ankle of a careless pursuer. Several supply caches, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. I worked fast, silent as shadow. Movements were honed, brought to automatism. My body remembered everything it had been taught over 20 years. By dawn, everything was ready. I took up an observation position on a high ridge half a mile from the cabin. From here, I had an excellent view of the road and approaches to the house. I spread out my tarp, lay down, covered myself with the ghillie suit, blending with the snow-covered ground, and trained the binoculars on the road. Now all that remained was to wait. Waiting is part of the work too. The ability to wait while maintaining extreme focus separates professionals from amateurs. In special operations, they taught us to wait for hours, days in any weather, any position, without moving. I watched my cabin. It looked empty and abandoned. No smoke from the chimney, windows dark. Perfect bait. I'd left a few surprises inside for uninvited guests, non-lethal ones. For now, I wanted to see who would come, assess their level, equipment, tactics. The day dragged agonizingly. The sun rose over the forest, illuminating snow-capped pine tops. The silence was absolute, broken only by a woodpecker's cry. I lay motionless, scanning the terrain. Inside was emptiness. No fear, no anxiety, only cold, ringing readiness. I had become again what I was born to be, a hunter. Only now the prey was human. By evening of the second day, I saw them. First, I heard the low, rumbling sound of engines you couldn't mistake for a pickup or logging truck. Then they appeared on the road, 2 black Range Rovers. They stopped a quarter-mile from my house, not daring to come closer. 8 men emerged from the vehicles, all in identical black tactical clothing, load-bearing vests, carrying weapons. AR-15-style rifles from the silhouettes. Professionals, not street thugs. Harrington had sent serious people. They operated competently. 2 stayed with the vehicles, controlling the road. 6 split into 2 3-man teams and began advancing toward the cabin from 2 directions, flanking it in an arc, using trees for cover. They moved by bounds, covering each other. Classic clearing tactics. I observed them through binoculars. They were led by a tall man about 50, gray at the temples. He gave orders with hand signals, confident and precise, obviously ex-military. I marked him as the primary target. Take out the commander and the team loses up to half its effectiveness. They surrounded the house, took positions, observed for several minutes. Then 2 rushed the door. 1 kicked it in. The second rolled inside, ready to fire. 2 more entered through windows. A minute later, they emerged. The commander approached them, received a report. I read his gestures. Empty. He left. No tracks. He was frustrated. He approached the house, looked inside, and at that moment, my first trap triggered. I'd rigged it above the door, a simple bucket of fish guts and blood I'd collected over the past week. It tipped right onto the gray-haired commander, drenching him head to toe in sticky, stinking slime. It wasn't lethal. It was humiliating. I wanted to throw him off balance, make him commit errors. Judging by how he froze, then furiously flung off the remaining guts, it worked. His men barely suppressed laughter. He barked something at them, and they immediately sobered. He gave the command to search the area. They began combing the forest around the house, and I knew it was time to begin the real hunt. I unslung the rifle, checked the optic, chambered around, and caught one of the operators who'd separated from the group in the crosshairs. I wasn't going to kill him. My target was the radio on his vest. Range, 900 yards, crosswind 3 meters per second. I adjusted for windage, held my breath, and smoothly pressed the trigger. The crack of the shot shattered the forest silence. It rang out like thunder in clear sky. A sharp, dry snap followed by rolling echo bouncing off the pines and fading into the wilderness. Harrington's team reacted instantly, as professionals should. They immediately went prone, melting among trees and boulders, raising rifles toward the suspected source of fire. My ridge. But they were searching for muzzle flash, smoke, any movement, while I'd already shifted 30 feet to the side, concealed again under my ghillie suit. Through the optic, I watched the operator I'd aimed at jerk and fall, clutching his chest. His teammates immediately crawled to him, preparing to render aid or drag him to cover. But he jumped up on his own, frantically patting his vest. He was unharmed, but his radio had been reduced to shattered plastic and wires. I smiled. Lesson number 1. You're off the net. Now you're alone in my forest. The gray-haired commander, whom I'd mentally dubbed Wolf, quickly assessed the situation. He understood he wasn't dealing with a frightened hunter, but someone far more dangerous. He gave orders again by hand signals. The group, now 5 strong, leaving one to cover their physically unharmed but mentally rattled comrade, began moving in my direction. They no longer advanced straight on. They moved cautiously, from cover to cover, constantly scanning the terrain. Wolf moved in the center, clearly understanding he was the primary target. Smart. But the forest is 3-dimensional space, and he was still thinking in only 2 dimensions. He was searching for me on the ground, but I was no longer there. My second position had been prepared in advance. A sniper's nest on a thick branch of a sprawling spruce, 60 feet above the ground. I'd climbed there before dawn, leaving only the tarp and a few branches on the ridge to simulate my presence. I watched them comb the ridge, watched them find my empty position. Wolf dropped to one knee, examining the shell casing I'd deliberately left. 7.62x 51mm NATO. He'd understand I was armed with military sniper weaponry. That would give him a headache. He raised his head, began scanning the trees. He was starting to think in 3 dimensions. Too late. I didn't shoot. A second shot from essentially the same position would be a gross error. Instead, I prepared their second surprise. While they were on the ridge, I silently slid down a cable I'd rigged between trees beforehand, ending up in a hollow in dense spruce cover they'd already passed. I'd gotten behind them. Now I was the hunter on their trail. The snow made my task easier. Their tracks were clearly visible, 8 pairs of heavy tactical boots. They moved in a tight group, confident the enemy was ahead. I followed them at 300 feet, like a shadow, stepping silent as a lynx. I could see them growing nervous. They kept looking back, flinching at every snapping branch. My forest was beginning to press on them. The silence that brought me peace had become a source of threat to them. In it could hide the shot they wouldn't even hear. I decided to increase the pressure. I pulled from my pack an elk call, let out a long, mournful bellow. The sound swept through the forest, making them jump and raise weapons. They didn't know that in November elk don't call like that, but their city brains didn't register such details. For them, it was just another eerie sound from a hostile world. When dusk began to fall, they made camp. They chose a small clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth. Not a bad spot, but not ideal. They posted 2 sentries, built a small fire. Apparently they were freezing. Mistake number 3. Fire at night is visible for miles. It not only provides warmth, but betrays your position and destroys night vision. I lay 500 feet away, observing them through the night scope. They sat by the fire, ate MREs, talked quietly. Wolf walked the perimeter, checking posts. He was tense as a drawn bowstring. I decided it was time to teach them lesson number 2. The lesson that in my forest, you don't sleep soundly. I waited until deep night, when exhaustion and cold began to take their toll. The sentries were nodding off, the rest sleeping in tents. I removed my boots, staying in thick wool socks. The snow felt pleasantly cool on my feet. I moved toward their camp, not on the ground, through the trees. I went from branch to branch like a squirrel, making no sound. It required immense physical strength and skill, but my body was ready for such demands. I hung in the tree directly above their camp, 30 feet above the tent where Wolf slept. Through the thermal mode on my binoculars, I could see their heat signatures. 4 people in one tent, 3 in another. 2 sentries. I pulled my gift from the pack, several glass jars filled with a mixture of turpentine and ammonia. A sharp, acrid smell that mimics bear urine and repels most animals. But more importantly, it triggers panic in people who don't understand its source. Carefully, one after another, I dropped the jars to the ground around the perimeter of their camp. They shattered with quiet tinkles. The acrid, choking smell began spreading across the clearing. The sentries smelled it first. They jumped up, began looking around, not understanding what was happening. Then the smell penetrated the tents. From inside came coughing, cursing. People began crawling outside, trying to identify the source of the stench. Chaos erupted. Wolf burst from his tent, trying to restore order, but his men were disoriented. They were convinced they'd been attacked with some kind of chemical agent. Panic is a terrible weapon. It strips away the ability to think logically. And while they scrambled around the clearing, I did my work. I descended from the tree on the opposite side of camp, crawled to their Range Rovers left on the road, and knifed all 8 tires. Then I opened the gas tanks and poured half a kilo of sugar into each one. Engines done. Lesson number 2, you're not driving out of here. Now you're on foot. I withdrew to a safe distance and took position again, waiting for dawn. Morning would bring them an unpleasant surprise. They'd find themselves dozens of miles from civilization. No communications, no transport. In a forest where every rustle would seem a mortal threat. And with each passing hour, their confidence would melt and their fear would grow. I wasn't planning to kill them. Not yet. Death would be too easy an escape. I wanted to break them, dismantle them like an old rusted mechanism, make them curse the day they decided to come into my forest. I wanted Wolf, when he returned to his boss, if he returned at all, to report that hunting game warden Walker was suicide and that Harrington's empire wasn't worth one small wooden falcon carved from Montana cedar. I caught myself realizing that for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was completely absorbed in the present. War had returned to my life, and terrifying as it was to admit, I felt in my element. I felt alive. Dawn in the Montana wilderness is a slow, almost reluctant awakening of the world. Gray light filters through dense pine canopies, fog blankets the hollows, and silence becomes so dense you could almost touch it. For Harrington's men, this dawn brought not peace, but the realization of total failure. I observed them through binoculars from my new position on a rocky outcrop. The picture was eloquent. They discovered the slashed tires and understood their vehicles had become useless piles of metal. Wolf was furious. He kicked the ruined tires, shouted at his men. They stood dejected, demoralized. The nighttime chemical attack, as they'd surely labeled it, and the destruction of transport had finished off their fighting spirit. They'd spent less than a day in my forest, but already looked like a beaten army. They held a brief conference. Wolf jabbed his finger at a map, obviously planning a walking route back to Timber Ridge. It was the only sound decision. But 40 miles across rough terrain for unprepared men, even ex-military, was a serious ordeal, especially when an invisible enemy stalked your heels. I decided it was time to teach them lesson number 3, the lesson in navigation. I let them gather themselves, shoulder their heavy packs, and set off. They walked the road. It was the simplest route. I moved parallel through the forest, staying invisible but constantly letting them know I was near. I began with acoustic pressure. I used my set of calls. First was wolf howls, rising very close to them. They stopped, bunched together, nervously raising rifles. Then from the other direction came the crack of breaking branches, as if a large animal, a bear or moose, was approaching. They froze again. I played with them like a cat with mice, jerking their nerves, forcing them to stay constantly on edge. A human can't remain in heightened combat readiness for long. The resources of psyche and body are exhausted. After several hours of this march, they'd be worn to the limit. After a couple miles, I arranged a little surprise on the road. I'd felled a massive old pine across the track beforehand. They had to detour through the forest, and here my trap awaited. I didn't use pit traps with stakes. That would be too simple. I used knowledge gained in another life. I dug a shallow pit on the trail they'd have to take and camouflaged it. But there were no sharp stakes at the bottom. There lay a pig's head I'd taken from my cold storage and several liters of blood. One of the operators fell in up to his knees. He wasn't physically hurt, but when he pulled out his leg smeared with blood and slime and saw at the bottom of the pit the pig's head with empty eye sockets, his nerves snapped. He screamed, piercing, hysterical. It was the sound of a broken man. Wolf ran to him, slapped his face, trying to bring him around, but the effect was achieved. The rest watched in horror. They understood their pursuer wasn't simply trying to kill them. He was tormenting them, playing with their fears, turning them into prey, not just physically but mentally. They moved on, but now their formation was disrupted. They walked looking over their shoulders, flinching at every rustle. The man who'd fallen in the pit trudged behind, muttering to himself. He was out of the game. At that moment, a memory washed over me, as cold and sticky as the blood in that pit. Afghanistan. We were moving through a valley. There were 8 of us in the point element too, and someone was hurting us as well. We didn't hear or see him, but we felt his presence. It was a sniper working our commander. He didn't shoot, he just left signs. A spent casing from his rifle on the trail here, a fresh notch carved in a tree there, exactly at head height. He played with us, showing he could kill at any moment but chose not to. He was wearing us down, making the commander nervous, forcing bad decisions. That's when I first understood the most terrible weapon in war isn't bullets or explosives. It's fear, the ability to plant it in the enemy's soul, make him afraid not of death, but of the unknown. Sarah walked beside me then. She sensed my tension. "Something wrong, Mason?" she asked quietly over internal comms. "He's playing with us," I answered. "This sniper's a psychologist. He's breaking the commander." "We need to take him out," she said. "I can't. I don't see him. He's like a ghost. But he'll make a mistake. They always make a mistake." And he did. He got too absorbed in his game, allowed himself one sign too many, giving away his approximate position. That was enough. My shot was accurate. Afterward, we found his hide. It was a local mercenary, an old experienced fighter. And beside him, we found a radio tuned to our frequency. He wasn't just watching, he was listening to our comms. And that's when I first felt the icy touch of betrayal. Someone on our side had leaked our frequency en route to him. I blinked, returning to Montana reality. Harrington's men had stopped for a break. They were completely exhausted. Wolf tried to rally them, but his authority was visibly melting. I decided it was time to strike the next blow. Not at them, at their faith in their commander. I circled around them and took position ahead on their route, at a small wooden footbridge over a creek. The bridge was old, rotting. I'd partially sawed through one of the center supports beforehand, not all the way, just enough so it would hold the weight of a few men, but collapse under the weight of the entire group. They approached the bridge. Wolf, as befits a commander, went first to check its strength. He crossed. The bridge held. He waved the rest forward, and they all went together in a bunch. Fatal mistake. When they were at the middle, the support cracked. The bridge tilted, and 3 of them, including the one who'd screamed at the pit, plunged down into the icy creek water. It wasn't deep, waist high, but it was enough. They were soaked to the skin. Their weapons and gear were wet. Getting soaked in a November forest is nearly a death sentence. You can die of hypothermia in hours. Wolf and the others dragged them to shore. They shook from cold and fear. Now they weren't just exhausted. They had 3 wounded, or rather non-combat capable. They'd have to carry them or abandon them. Wolf stood staring at the collapsed bridge. I could see his face through the optic. It didn't show rage. It showed understanding. He understood this was no accident. The felled tree, the pit, the bridge, links in one chain. He understood their opponent knew their every move in advance. He was playing by his own rules on his own territory, And in this game, they were merely pawns. I didn't shoot again. Why? Cold, exhaustion, and fear would kill them more slowly and painfully than a bullet. I wanted them to return crippled, broken, but alive, so they could tell Harrington in their own words what the Montana wilderness was and who the quiet game warden Ethan Walker was. So the fear would pass up the chain, from these pawns to their king, because the real fight was still ahead, and it wouldn't be here in the forest. It would be there, in the concrete jungle of Chicago. I stowed the rifle and silently vanished into the forest, leaving them to deal with their problems. The lesson was finished. Now I awaited their next move. I was certain that after the fiasco at the bridge, Harrington's team would retreat, that they'd gather their soaked and demoralized fighters and limp back to civilization to report their failure. I'd underestimated Wolf. He proved a more resilient and clever opponent than I'd anticipated. I observed them from a distance, expecting them to turn back. But after making camp and somehow drying their men by a fire, the next day they continued moving not back, but deeper into the forest, straight toward my cabin. This puzzled me. Why? The house is empty. They know that. Going there means exposing themselves to attack again. There was no logic in it. And when a professional's actions lack logic, it means it's part of a plan you don't yet see. I became more cautious. I followed them but increased the distance. Analyzed their behavior. They moved slowly but confidently. Wolf no longer allowed his men to bunch up. They moved in an extended line, constantly controlling sectors. They no longer reacted to my acoustic tricks. When I howled like a wolf again, they didn't even flinch. They were adapting, learning, and that made them more dangerous. I understood that Wolf had changed tactics. He was no longer the victim. He was becoming the hunter. He realized he couldn't catch me in the forest, but he could make me come to him. He was heading to my house because he knew it was my territory, my den, and any predator will defend his den. He was turning my fortress into bait. When they reached the cabin, they didn't storm it. They surrounded it, took positions, and waited. An hour passed, then another. Nothing happened. I lay in my position observing, trying to decipher his plan. Then I saw movement. One of his operators, the same one whose radio I'd destroyed, separated from the group and walked toward the forest. He moved uncertainly, constantly looking around. He looked terrible, pale, exhausted. He went about 300 feet from the house and sat under a tree, clutching his head in his hands. He was a perfect target. Open ground, no cover. This was bait. Classic tactic. Position one operator as the weak link, a deserter or wounded man, and take positions waiting for the enemy to decide to take a prisoner or eliminate an easy target. The other 5, including Wolf, surely already had this square under crossfire. I smiled. Not bad, Wolf. You're starting to think like me. But you're still in my forest. I didn't shoot the bait. That would be foolish. Instead, I decided to respond asymmetrically. Since he'd turned my house into a trap, I'd strike at what he considered his rear, their vehicles. I left them watching their bait and, making a wide loop, came out to the road where 2 crippled Range Rovers stood. No one was near them. They were confident nothing threatened them here. Another mistake. I approached one of the vehicles, pulled from my pack a small flask of gasoline I always carry for fire starting, and a rag. I wasn't going to start a big fire. I needed smoke, thick, black, visible from far away. I opened the hood, poured gasoline on the engine and lit it. Flame shot upward, and within a minute, acrid black smoke poured from under the hood, rising in a column above the treetops. Signal sent. Now Wolf had a choice. Either continue sitting in ambush at my house, hoping I'd bite on the bait, or abandon everything and run to the vehicles to save what little they had left. He chose the second. Through binoculars, I watched them jump up, quickly gather and run toward the road. The ambush had failed. I'd outplayed him again, but simple smoke wasn't enough for me. I wanted to leave him a message. I found a piece of birch bark, pulled from my pocket a piece of charcoal from a cold fire, and scratched out a few words. Your son started this. You can end it. Go home. I attached the bark to the windshield of the second vehicle, wedging it under the wiper. When they arrived, I was already far away. I watched them extinguish the burning engine, watched Wolf find my message. He stood a long time reading it, then crumpled the bark and furiously hurled it to the ground. I'd gotten under his skin. I'd shown him I knew who he was and who'd sent him. I'd shifted the conflict from faceless confrontation to personal address. It was a strong psychological move. I was certain that now he'd definitely retreat, but I was wrong again. Wolf proved not just an executor, he was a fanatic, devoted to his master. Or he feared Harrington more than he feared me. The next day they didn't leave. They did something I never expected. They burned my house. I saw the smoke from far away and understood what had happened. When I got closer, the cabin was already blazing like a huge bonfire. Dry wood burned hot, and there was no chance of saving anything. They stood and watched the fire. On their faces was grim satisfaction. They couldn't catch the beast, so they burned his den. It was an act of desperation, an act of impotent rage. I lay in the snow watching fire devour 6 years of my life, 6 years of silence, peace, attempts to forget. In the flames burned my books, my simple furniture, my carved figures, everything that made up my small world. And I felt nothing, no anger, no regret, only cold, crystal-clear emptiness. This house was just a shelter, a shell in which I'd been hiding. Now it was gone, and I had nowhere left to hide. At that moment, another memory washed over me. Mountains. Night. We were withdrawing after a failed operation. I was carrying the wounded commander on my back. He was unconscious. I'd been going for 2 days without sleep or food. My strength was nearly gone. I found a shepherd's shelter, abandoned and half-ruined, dragged the commander inside, piled rocks at the entrance and passed out. When I came to, I saw her, Sarah. She stood in the opening, and behind her dawn was breaking. I thought it was a hallucination, that I'd died and she'd come for me. But she approached, touched my cheek. Her hand was warm, alive. "Mason, you're alive," she whispered. I couldn't believe it. "But how? I saw the explosion." "The blast threw me into a crevice," she said. "I was unconscious. When I came to, everyone was gone. I followed your tracks. I knew you wouldn't abandon the commander." In that moment, I understood my home wasn't walls. My home was her. And when she was gone, I became homeless forever. I watched my cabin burn down. Wolf's men left. They decided the job was done. They left behind ashes, confident they'd broken me. They didn't understand they'd just freed me. They'd burned my cage. Now I had nothing left to lose except memory and the wooden falcon in my pocket. I waited until they'd gone far enough. Then I approached the ashes. The heat was still intense. I stood a moment, saying goodbye to this place, then turned and walked away. Not deeper into the forest, but following their trail. The hunt wasn't over. It was only beginning. Now I wouldn't play games. I would kill. Following their trail was easy. They no longer tried to hide, confident their mission was accomplished. They were heading for the road to call for backup or find a ride. They were relaxed, and that became their final mistake. I caught up with them by evening. They'd made camp for the night in an old hunting cabin. Smoke from the chimney again betrayed their position. I observed them for several hours, studying their routine, posts, numbers. 7 remained, including Wolf. They were exhausted, but burning my house had clearly lifted their spirits. They talked loudly, laughed, drank something from flasks. They were celebrating victory. I waited for deep night, that hour between dog and wolf when sleep is deepest and vigilance is at 0. I stripped off everything that could make sound, keeping only the knife, rifle, and 1 spare magazine. I smeared my face with soot from burned wood. I moved not as a man, but as part of the night forest. Every step measured, every movement smooth. There were 2 sentries. One sat by the cabin entrance, the other patrolled the perimeter. I chose the one who was moving. A moving target is always more vulnerable than a stationary one. I crept up on him from behind at the moment he stopped to light a cigarette. The flare of the lighter blinded him momentarily, and that moment was all I needed. My left hand clamped over his mouth, my right delivered 1 short, precise knife thrust under the ribs, straight to the heart. He went limp in my arms without a sound. I carefully lowered him to the ground, into the shadow of a pine. -1. The second sentry sat leaning against the cabin wall. He was dozing. I could have eliminated him just as quietly, but I needed a distraction. I picked up a rock from the ground and hurled it in the opposite direction from the cabin. The rock struck a tree with a loud crack. The sentry jerked, jumped up, raising his rifle. "Who's there?" he whispered nervously, peering into the darkness. He took several steps toward the noise, abandoning his post. That was all I needed. I slipped through the half-open cabin door. Inside, 5 men slept on bunks. The air was stale, smelling of sweat and alcohol. I moved between sleeping bodies like a ghost. My target was Wolf. I recognized him even in darkness. He slept apart from the others, against the far wall. I raised the knife. At that moment, something clicked in my head. I didn't see his face. I saw Sarah's face, her dead, surprised face, and the rage I'd suppressed for 8 years burst out. This wasn't the cold fury of a professional. This was white-hot, all-consuming hatred of a man who'd had everything taken from him. I wanted him to suffer, to die in agony, but I couldn't. Something stopped me, the voice of an instructor from the distant past. Emotion is an operative's greatest enemy. It makes you weak and predictable. I exhaled, collected myself. The kill should be clean, quick and silent, but fate had other plans. At the moment I was ready to strike, one of the operators on a neighboring bunk stirred in his sleep and sat up sharply. Our eyes met in the half-light. For a second he looked at me, not understanding who I was. Then his face twisted in horror, and he opened his mouth to scream. There was no time to hesitate. I threw the knife at him. The blade entered his throat precisely, cutting off the scream mid-sound. But he managed to make a short, gurgling noise. It was enough. Wolf woke instantly. He didn't jump up, didn't shout. He rolled off the bunk, simultaneously pulling a pistol from under his pillow. Professional. Even in sleep, he was ready for combat. Hell broke loose in the cabin. The others woke, began firing blindly into darkness. Bullets screamed into wooden walls. I rolled under the bunks, pulling out my rifle. Working with a long gun in confined space was suicide, but I had no choice. I fired toward a muzzle flash. A scream of pain rang out. I rolled, changing position. Another flash. Another shot from me. Another scream. They fired randomly while I could see them in my scope, backlit by moonlight from the window. In seconds it was over. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the moans of a wounded man. I slowly rose. 3 lifeless bodies lay on the bunks. One groaned, clutching a wound, and Wolf was nowhere. He'd vanished. I understood he'd slipped out the back window during the firefight. I rushed to the exit. The sentry I'd distracted lay on the ground with a bullet through his head, caught in his own side's fire. Total -6. Only Wolf remained. I ran outside and saw his tracks leading into the forest. He was wounded. Drops of blood spotted the snow. I'd crossed a line. Until this night, I'd only frightened and crippled. Now I was killing. And the most terrifying thing was that I felt nothing. No revulsion, no pity, only the icy calm of a surgeon who'd removed a cancerous tumor. 8 years I'd tried to convince myself I was different, that I was a game warden, a fisherman, a hermit. But it was a lie. I was and remained a wolf. I'd just pretended to be a sheep for a while. And now the real wolf, wounded but still dangerous, was fleeing from me through the snowy forest. I checked the rifle's magazine, chambered around, and followed the blood trail. This night wasn't over yet. Tracking a wounded animal through snow is a science. You don't just follow tracks. You think like him, predict his actions, understand his fear and pain. Wolf was wounded in the leg, judging by the pattern of tracks and amount of blood. The wound wasn't fatal, but it slowed him and caused hellish pain, especially in the cold. He couldn't go far. He had to hide somewhere, try to treat himself or set an ambush. I didn't follow his tracks openly. I moved parallel, in the shadow of trees, constantly stopping to listen to the forest. I knew he was waiting for me. This was the final battle, a duel between 2 professionals on an arena of snowy wilderness. As I walked, the forest around me changed. Pines and spruce gave way to rocky ledges and deep ravines. This terrain reminded me of another place, another time, that cursed valley in the mountains. Memories rushed back with new force, so vivid it could have been yesterday. We walked into an ambush. Fire opened from 3 sides at once. The valley slopes that should have been clear suddenly came alive. Bullets struck sparks from rocks, whistled overhead. Our Humvee at point position burst into flames like a torch, blocking the road. We dismounted, took defensive positions behind boulders. But there were too few of us. They outnumbered us by dozens. They poured lead down from the heights, not letting us raise our heads. Sarah worked the radio, trying to call for support. "Base, this is South 5. Repeat, we are in heavy contact. Coordinates. We're pinned in the valley. Request air support. Repeat, we are in heavy contact." In response, silence, only the crackle of static. "No comms, Mason," she shouted to me. "They're jamming everything." And then I understood. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a trap. The traitor hadn't just leaked our route, he'd leaked our frequencies. He knew we wouldn't be able to call for help. We'd been sent here to die. "Fall back," the commander shouted. "Team, withdraw to the rocks. Cover each other." We began retreating under withering fire. I fired short bursts, changing position. One of our men fell beside me, then another. I watched Sarah returning fire with her short-barrel rifle, dragging a wounded operator on her back. She wasn't just a comm specialist. She was a warrior, strong and brave. I rushed to help her. "I'll cover you! Go!" I shouted. At that moment, a grenade launcher struck from the slope. The explosion thundered right next to us. It threw me against rocks, stunned me. I lost consciousness for seconds, and when I came to, I saw her. She lay in the snow. Her eyes were open, looking at the gray sky with surprise. Around her spread a dark stain of blood. I crawled to her, grabbed her hand. "Sarah! Sarah, hang on!" She turned her head, looked at me. In her gaze was no fear, only infinite tenderness and regret. She tried to say something, but blood came from her lips. She only squeezed my hand and held out to me her wooden falcon that she'd always worn around her neck. And then her eyes glazed over. I roared with an inhuman animal voice. I jumped to full height, pouring lead into the slopes, ignoring the bullets whistling around me. I wanted to die there beside her, but the commander struck me with a rifle butt to the head, and I fell into darkness again. I shook my head, driving away the vision. I stood at the edge of a ravine in the Montana forest. Below, among the rocks, were Wolf's fresh tracks. He'd descended there. Perfect place for an ambush. I didn't follow him. I circled the ravine along the rim, searching for a good observation position, and I found it. Wolf sat under an overhanging rock, tying a tourniquet around his wounded leg. His pistol lay beside him. He was waiting for me to appear on the ravine's edge, silhouetted against the sky. Easy target. But I was to the side. He didn't see me. I caught him in my scope. His face was gray from pain and blood loss, but his eyes held steel determination. He was ready to die, but take me with him. And then I noticed something strange. On his arm, on his wrist, was a tattoo. Small, almost invisible. A wolf's head in flames. I'd seen this tattoo before, in that former life. Operators from one of the Special Forces units wore the same one. An elite team that often worked in coordination with us in Afghanistan, and that was supposed to cover our withdrawal in that valley. But they didn't come. Their commander reported they'd run into an ambush elsewhere and couldn't break through. It was a lie. There was no ambush. They simply stood a few miles away and waited while we were destroyed. And the commander of that unit was a man named Keller. I didn't remember his face, but I remembered his call sign. Wolf. My blood ran cold. Everything fell into place. This wolf hunting me in Montana, and that wolf who betrayed us in the mountains, they could be the same man. It explained everything. His professionalism, his persistence, his loyalty to Harrington. Probably after that incident, he was discharged from the service and went to work for a crime boss, and Harrington was somehow connected to those events. Perhaps that operation interfered with his business, drug trafficking, arms dealing, and he paid to have us eliminated. I lowered the rifle. Killing him now would be too simple, too merciful. I wanted answers. I wanted him to look me in the eyes and tell me why. Why he condemned 12 brothers in arms to death. Why he killed Sarah. I raised the rifle and fired, not at him, but at the rock beside his head. The bullet struck a shower of sparks. Wolf jerked, raised his pistol, trying to find me. Keller, I shouted. My voice echoed through the ravine. He froze. His face twisted. He hadn't expected to hear his real name here. Who the hell are you? He shouted hoarsely. You don't remember me, I answered, shifting to another position. But you remember the valley outside Kandahar. February 2017. Task Force South. You were supposed to cover us. He was silent, only breathing heavily. You left us to die, you bastard, I continued, my voice shaking with hatred. How much did Harrington pay you? What was the price for 12 operators' lives? What was the price for my wife's life? He jumped up, leaning on his good leg, and fired wildly in my direction. Bullets clicked off rocks far from me. He was panicking. I let him empty his magazine. When the silence was broken by the click of an empty slide, I stepped from behind the rock without my weapon. I slowly walked down toward him, into the ravine. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not hatred but animal terror. He looked at me like a ghost risen from the dead. I descended into the ravine slowly, not taking my eyes off him. He stood swaying, leaning against the rock. The empty pistol was still clenched in his hand. On his face mixed pain, fear, and absolute disbelief. To him I was a dead man, one of many ghosts that must have visited him at night, and now one of the ghosts had taken flesh and come for him. You, he rasped when I came within 30 feet. Mason, commander of Task Force South. But you died. All of you. As you can see, not all of us. I stopped. You do your work poorly, Keller. Then and now. Always leaving survivors. He looked at me, and recognition flashed in his eyes. He remembered. It was you. At the bar? That game warden, he whispered. I tried to live peacefully, tried to forget. But your boss and his pups left me no choice. They woke what had been sleeping for 8 years. And now I want to know why. Why did you betray us? He smirked with a crooked, bloody grin. Betrayed? I was following orders. Whose orders? My voice broke into a shout. Orders to leave your own for slaughter? You don't understand anything. He shook his head. It wasn't your war. It was a war of big money. Harrington controlled that route across the border. Weapons, drugs. Your operation would have shut down that channel, and a very powerful man in Washington ordered me not to interfere. Just let the fighters do their work. Harrington paid generously, both me and that man. Everything was as I'd thought, banal and dirty. We, elite operators, were traded like pawns for the criminal interests of some corrupt official and oligarch. Our lives, our oath, our honor, all of it proved cheaper than a shipment of heroin or a crate of rifles. And Sarah, she died so some man in an expensive suit could keep lining his pockets. Who's this man in Washington? Name? I demanded. Keller laughed. You think I'll tell you so you can go after him? He'll crush you like a bug. He has power you can't even imagine. I don't give a damn about his power. I need a name. Kill me. I won't tell you anything. I could see he wasn't lying. He was broken, wounded, but he was a soldier of the old school. He'd stay silent to the end. But I didn't need him to talk. I needed confirmation, and I'd gotten it. Now I knew Harrington wasn't just a crime boss. He was part of a large, rotten system, and to reach the top, I first had to cut down the trunk. I approached him closely. He flinched but didn't retreat. I looked into his eyes and saw no remorse there. Only the weariness and cynicism of a man who'd long since sold his soul. Your war is over, Wolf, I said quietly. He closed his eyes, expecting a strike or shot, but I didn't kill him. Death would have been a release for him. I pulled a tourniquet from my med kit and threw it at his feet. Tie off that leg if you don't want to bleed out. Go to Timber Ridge. Tell Harrington that Mason, commander of Task Force South, is alive, and I'm coming for him. Tell him he took my forest from me. Now I'm coming to take his city. He looked at me in surprise. You're letting me go? I'm not an executioner. I'm a soldier, and you're no longer an opponent. You're just a wounded, unarmed man. Go. I turned and walked away from the ravine without looking back. I knew he wouldn't shoot me in the back, not because he was honorable, but because he was broken. I left him alone with his demons. That punishment is worse than death. Now I had a plan. I could no longer hide in the forest. My war was moving to new territory, to Chicago, to Harrington's lair. But I couldn't go there empty-handed. I was one man against an entire criminal empire and its protectors in power. I needed help, and I knew who to turn to. In my former life, there was one man who owed me. Not just owed me, I'd saved his life during an operation in Africa, pulling him wounded from under fire. His name was Leo, former analyst for our agency, a computer tech genius, discharged for excessive curiosity and hacking government servers. Now he was a freelancer, a hacker of the highest class, living somewhere in Eastern Europe and working for whoever paid well. He owed me a debt of honor, and the time had come to collect. I reached one of my caches, the furthest and most secure. In it, besides supplies, lay a satellite phone wrapped in oiled cloth. I hadn't turned it on in 8 years. The battery was nearly dead, but it was enough. I dialed an encrypted number I'd memorized. After a long wait, a familiar, slightly ironic voice came through. "Listening. If this is the Russian laundromat, you have the wrong number. The laundromat needs the best specialist in removing old bloodstains," I said using the code phrase. "Recognize me, Leo?" Silence hung in the line for several seconds. "Mason?" Leo's voice changed. Shock rang through it. "It can't be. You were buried." "Reports of my death were somewhat exaggerated. I need your help. I'm calling in the debt." "Anything, Commander. For you. Anything. What happened?" "I don't have much time. I need everything on a man named Marcus Harrington, Chicago businessman. I want it all. His business, assets, partners, enemies, dirty laundry, especially his connections in government and contacts dated 2017. I need a weapon, an information weapon. I want to destroy his empire down to the foundation." "Serious order," Leo whistled. "But I understand. It'll be done. Where should I send the information?" "Create an anonymous email. I'll make contact in 24 hours from the city. And Leo, thanks." "Don't thank me, Mason. You saved my life. I'm just returning the favor. Take care of yourself. The world changed while you were gone. It got even dirtier." I disconnected. The phone immediately died. That was my last bridge to the past. Now I was alone. I burned the rest of my gear, changed into simple civilian clothes that were also stored in the cache. Jeans, sweater, worn jacket. I took a small backpack with cash and documents in the name of Ethan Walker and left my forest on foot, heading south toward the highway. I walked all night, and with each step I left behind not just Montana, but 6 years of my life. 6 years of illusion. Ahead was the city, ahead was war, and I was ready for it. Getting to Chicago was long and complicated. I reached the highway, caught a ride with a logging truck that took me to Missoula. From there, on a night bus among snoring workers and students, I rode to the city. I got off at Union Station early in the morning. The city greeted me with leaden sky, damp wind off the lake, and the roar of traffic. I hadn't been in a big city for 8 years. The sensations were strange. I felt like a foreign body in this enormous, breathing organism. My instincts, honed in the forest, were useless here. Instead of the scent of pine and damp earth, exhaust fumes. Instead of silence, cacophony of sounds. I had to adapt quickly. First, I found a cheap hostel on the outskirts, paid cash for a bunk in a shared room. I needed a place to catch my breath and receive information from Leo. I bought the cheapest smartphone and SIM card, went to an internet cafe, and created an anonymous email account. As we'd agreed, the password was complex, consisting of coordinates of the place where I'd saved Leo. An hour later, an email arrived. One word, check, followed by a link to an encrypted file-sharing service. I downloaded the archive. It was massive, several gigabytes of documents, photographs, audio recordings, financial reports. Leo had done colossal work. He'd cracked Harrington's servers, bank accounts, email, phones, and his entire circle. This was the complete underbelly of his empire. I sat in the dimly lit internet cafe for hours, studying the materials, and the deeper I dove, the clearer I understood the scale of the rot. Harrington wasn't just a gangster. He was an octopus who'd extended tentacles everywhere. Ports, logistics, construction, pharmaceuticals. That was just cover. His real business was industrial-scale smuggling, weapons from conflict zones, drugs from Asia, illegal migrants, human trafficking. He'd built an entire underground empire relying on corrupt officials, law enforcement, judges. His name was synonymous with fear and power in certain circles, and I found what I was looking for. The 2017 connection, a chain of bank transactions. A large sum transferred from an offshore company account owned by Harrington to another company belonging to the wife of a high-ranking general in the Department of Defense. A general who personally oversaw our operation in Afghanistan and gave the order for Keller not to intervene. His name was Morrison. There it was, the name of the traitor, the man who sold us for Harrington's money. I looked at his photograph, a well-fed, sleek face with empty eyes, and understood. My target wasn't just Harrington. My target was this entire rotten chain. But first I needed to deal with Harrington. Attacking him head-on would be suicide. He had an army of guards, connections in the police. I needed to act more subtly. I needed to destroy his web, turn his allies against him, strip him of resources and support. I decided to start with his competitors. In Leo's files was information about Harrington's old war with another major Chicago criminal organization, headed by a boss nicknamed the Chechen. The war had ended in fragile peace, but the hatred remained. I found compromising material on one of Harrington's closest men who handled drug logistics, recordings of his phone conversations where he spoke disparagingly of the Chechen and bragged about how they'd screwed him on the last deal. I anonymously leaked these recordings to the Chechen's people and waited. The result didn't take long. 2 days later, the news reported a brazen attack on one of the port warehouses. The warehouse belonged to Harrington. It was burned to the ground, along with a shipment worth tens of millions of dollars. Several of Harrington's guards died in the shootout. The gang war had resumed. While Harrington was busy putting out that fire, I struck a second blow to his finances. Using Leo's data, I sent anonymous messages to the IRS and Financial Crimes Unit. The letters contained detailed information about Harrington's money laundering schemes, his offshore account numbers, names of shell company directors. I attached scans of documents that left no doubt of his guilt. The system he'd built so long and carefully began to fail. Investigators came knocking, his accounts began to freeze. The third blow was psychological. I learned Harrington had a mistress, a young model he kept in an elite downtown apartment. I didn't touch her. I simply sent her a bouquet of flowers with a note. Your Marcus isn't who he claims to be. Ask him about the valley and the mountains and run before it's too late. And to Harrington's wife, I sent photographs of her husband with this model. I sowed chaos and paranoia in his world. He was under attack from every direction, unable to understand where the blows were coming from. His enemies mobilized. His partners began turning away. His financial empire was cracking at the seams. And in his personal life, hell reigned. He found himself isolated, weakened, enraged, losing control. That's exactly how I needed him. I knew he'd now search for the source of his troubles. He'd understand it wasn't about competitors or the IRS. He'd remember the words Keller delivered. Mason, commander of Task Force South, is alive and he's coming for you. He'd understand that behind all this stood me, a ghost from the past, and he'd make a mistake. He'd try to find me. He'd throw all his forces into the search, weakening protection of his main asset, himself. I waited. I rented a small apartment in Brooklyn, again paying cash. I lived quietly, attracting no attention. Every day I went out into the city, simply walked the streets, watching my enemy's empire crumble. I felt like a director who'd staged a play and now observed from the audience. A play whose finale would be bloody. A week later, Harrington did what I'd expected. He panicked. His empire was disintegrating before his eyes. Competitors were squeezing out his business. The law enforcement officials he'd fed for years turned away, afraid of getting caught in the rolling investigations. He found himself alone in his luxurious estate in the suburbs, surrounded only by his most loyal bodyguards. He understood I was somewhere nearby, and fear became his chief advisor. He decided to run. Leo informed me that Harrington had chartered a private jet to a non-extradition country and planned to fly out secretly that night from a small private airport outside Chicago. This was my chance, the last chance to end this war. I didn't set up an ambush at the airport. That would be too predictable and messy. I decided to pay him a visit at home, in his fortress. The night of his planned departure, I was already there. Harrington's estate was surrounded by high fencing, packed with cameras, motion sensors, and guards. An impregnable fortress for an ordinary person, but not for me. I spent 2 days observing it, studying guard shifts, camera blind spots, patrol schedules. I found the weak point, a small section of fence on the backside of the house, adjacent to a wooded area. The camera there periodically malfunctioned, cutting out for a few seconds. That was enough. At 3 in the morning, I was at the fence. I waited for the camera to blink, cut the razor wire, and silently climbed over. I was on his territory. I moved along the house wall like a shadow, melting into darkness. The guards were nervous but inattentive. They expected attack from the front entrance, not from inside. I circled the house and found what I was looking for, a window to the wine cellar. It was closed with bars, but Leo had sent me blueprints of the house in advance, and I knew these bars were decorative, for show. A few precise movements with a crowbar, and the bars gave way. I opened the window and slipped inside. I found myself in an enormous basement lined with racks of expensive wine. I moved through the house that I knew better than my own. I knew where the floorboards creaked, where cameras were positioned, where the guards slept. I was a ghost in his house. I climbed to the second floor. Harrington's bedroom. The door was ajar. He wasn't sleeping. He sat in an armchair by the fireplace where logs were burning down. Before him on the table stood a glass of whiskey and lay a pistol. He was dressed in an expensive robe, but his appearance was haggard. He'd aged 10 years this past week. He stared into the fire, and in his eyes was emptiness. I entered the room silently. He didn't hear me. "Good evening for running, Marcus," I said quietly. He jerked like he'd been electrocuted. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head. When he saw me standing in shadow, his face became a mask of horror. He lunged for the pistol. "I don't advise it," I said, stepping forward into the light. "You won't make it." He froze. His hand stopped an inch from the weapon. "You," he rasped. "Mason. I came to collect my debt. What do you want? Money? Take it all. Just leave me alive." His voice held pathetic, animal pleading. "I don't need your dirty money." I approached the fireplace and stood opposite him. "I came for justice. For Sarah. For 12 operators you helped murder. For 8 years of my stolen life." I pulled from my pocket the small wooden falcon carving and placed it on the stone mantel. "Recognize this? This was made by the hands of the woman you killed. Your boys wanted to take it from me. They woke the beast. And now the beast has come for you." He looked between me and the figurine, his lips trembling. "I didn't want to. It was just business. Morrison, it was all him," he babbled, trying to shift blame. "You and Morrison are two sides of the same coin. You'll both pay. He's next on my list." I approached the table and took his pistol, ejected the magazine, dumped the rounds on the carpet. "I'm not going to kill you, Harrington. That would be too easy. You're going to live a long time. In prison. You'll tell investigators everything about Morrison, about the smuggling, about the murders. You'll give up everyone. Otherwise, I'll return, and then I won't be so merciful." I turned and walked toward the exit. "Wait!" he shouted at my back. "Who are you? You're not just a soldier. You're the devil." I stopped in the doorway. "I'm the memory that can't be killed." I left his house as unnoticed as I'd entered. Outside, dawn was already breaking. Gray, cold Chicago dawn. I walked empty streets, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt not pain and not rage. I felt peace. The war wasn't over. I still had to reach General Morrison, but the main battle was won. I'd avenged Sarah. I'd cleared her name. I walked along the lakeshore. Wind ruffled my hair. I stopped, looked at the dark, cold water. From my pocket, I pulled out my falcon, held it in my palm, warming it with my heat, then wound up and threw it into the lake. It flashed in the air and disappeared into the water. I released my past. I released my pain. My vengeance was complete. Now I was free. Where I'd go next, I didn't know. Maybe back to the forest, maybe start a new life in this city. But one thing I knew for certain, I would no longer hide. Major Mason, Commander of Task Force South died in that valley, but the man who survived had finally learned to live again.